All right. Tonight we're going to talk about some phonetic variations and more specifically dialects. So when we talk about dialects, we're going to be covering information mainly within the United States. So when you think of dialects, you might think like I'm from Michigan, we have more nasal speech compared to maybe down here in the South, in Tennessee. You could think of different ways that you say a word compared to someone else you might know. So for instance, if I say the word pecan, like the nut, you may say pecan or pecan. So based on where you live, you can pronounce words differently. So we've talked about diacritics, which also help us determine how the sound is made differently than we expect. However, there's also another component that's not disordered. It's just based on the area we're living, we will use a different dialect than someone in another part of the country. So let's talk more specifically about dialects, okay? All right. So a dialect is going to be, more specifically, we're going to talk about regional dialects. So it's a variation in speech based on different geographical regions. And I do want to point out there's no standard dialect in the United States. There's no one dialect where this is how you should talk. Now there is that way in other countries, but here in the U.S. there might be a standard we teach in school as far as how to talk properly. It would be the same thing you'd hear in broadcasting, on the news, or in print media. However, there's no one standard golden rule for everything that we produce speech-wise. So one example, as far as the standard we're teaching in school, we wouldn't use the phrase borrow me $1. Instead, we'd use lend me $1. Okay? Let's talk about the 4 regional U.S. dialects that we do have. There's 4 main regions. We have the Western United States, the Middle United States, the Northern United States, and the Northeastern. And now I want to break down each of those for you, because even though there are only 4 regional dialects, there's a lot of different places within those regions. So, first region is going to be the Western United States. And first we're going to talk about the West. So this is our largest geographical area. We have California, Washington, Idaho, New Mexico, Nevada, lots of places, okay? Lots of different states. One of the characteristics of the West dialect is going to be the fronting of the vowel oo, okay? There's also something called the California chain shift, and basically it shifts our vowel diagram. So remember we talked about that diagram with all of our vowels, and it shows what's a front vowel and what's a back and high and low and things like that. Well, this California chain shift, it shifts all of the vowels, and it's going to indicate things in the West, such as the word cat is going to sound like the word caught, okay? So we're taking the tongue and we're moving the tongue back, all right? Now in Seattle, we're going to do something slightly different. It's very back and rounded oo, and part of this is more specifically in the town of Ballard, and this is where a lot of Scandinavian immigrants immigrated to. And so this very back rounded oo is significant, especially in this area, to those immigrants. Okay, next let's talk about the Middle United States. So we have Midland, St. Louis corridor, and when we're talking about Midland, we're talking about Western Ohio, Southern Indiana, much of Central and Southern Illinois, Missouri, and Eastern Kansas. And something that's common within the Midland dialects are going to include the fronting of oo, and anyone remember what that is? It's one of our diphthongs. That's the O, like go, okay? So we're fronting those sounds. And then also we have caught and cot are both going to sound like cat, okay? Or sorry, cot. Sorry about that. So they're both going to sound like cot. So cot makes sense, but even our caught will sound more like caught. Okay, there's a subtle difference there, sorry. And then with the St. Louis corridor, with that dialect, we're looking at St. Louis, Missouri, and a small area between St. Louis and Chicago, mainly on Interstate 55. So very specific here. And for this one, words like barn and far, that's going to sound more like aw, like caught, okay? So they have more the aw sound for the sounds that we have for barn and far, that are, okay? Let's move on then to the southern United States. So we have the South dialect. This is quite large as well. We have the Ohio River, the Missouri-Arkansas border, the Texas-Oklahoma border on the north side. We have the Texas-New Mexico border on the west, the Alabama, Florida, and the Florida-Georgia borders on the south, okay? And something very common to them is taking these two diphthongs and turning them into monophthongs. So one of them is the I, the AI, and that is one that tends to get dragged out or lengthened in the southern dialect. So turning it, rather than I, it's more I, okay? So it's more of a monophthong, meaning we're not dipping into two, we're not combining two. It sounds more like just one straight vowel, if that makes sense. All of the South does this. And then additionally in the South, there's some front vowel shifting for the oo and the o, okay? So we're shifting that vowel forward. In the inland South, this is more of the Appalachian Mountains, we also have the monophthong, so the I becomes more of a monophthong than a diphthong. And this is especially happening in the inland South region, okay? With the Texas South dialect, this is going to be northern and central Texas, and same thing. So our I diphthong is turning into more of a monophthong, okay? All right. Next, let's talk about the northern United States. So we have quite a few different kind of subsections within the northern United States. We have north central. This is going to be northern Minnesota, eastern Montana, North Dakota. They're going to use very back-rounded oo and ohs, okay? So they're going to pull that sound really far back. Oo and o, okay? We have the a, like in had. Well, let me go back. So I put a note here, the oo that they have, the very back-rounded oo, is like the Seattle dialect we talked about, and that's because also in this north central region there were a lot of Scandinavian immigrants there as well, so that kind of carries over. And now back to the a. So if we have an a before a g or an ing, that vowel will actually get changed to more of an a, and it will be extended, okay? So instead of bag, it's more like beg, okay? Bag, beg. So it's a little different there. We're changing the vowel. We also have the E and the oo. There's without a great deal of, this is a long word, but diphthongization. So it's more of a straight vowel compared to really showing how one vowel merges into the other during that diphthong. Okay, now let's talk about the north. So that's going to include central and southern Minnesota, eastern South Dakota, and northern Iowa. Now we talked about the Californian change switch or shift. Now we're going to talk about the northern city change shift. And the big thing here is that the ah is going to be really tense, okay? Ah, okay? In addition, we also have some low back vowels. So for instance, in the word cloth and lot, we have the ah that's going to be very similar, or it's going to make words like cot and caught very similar. Okay, next let's talk about the inland north. So I know I'm kind of going through these quickly. You have the slides here as well you can go back to. And really I just want to give you some idea because you'll be researching one of these areas more in depth for your cultural project. So with inland north, these are the southern and eastern shores of the Great Lakes. It undergoes the northern city change shift, just like the north does. However, there is a distinction between lot and cloth. However, there's not with the north that we just talked about. So those are kind of those are the same vowels, using the same vowels. However, in inland north, those are different vowels. There's also in the inland north something called the Canadian rising. So the I becomes more of, it changes to become, I see a spelling error there, sorry, before a voiceless obstruent consonant such as mice or fight, you're going to have more of a So that's going to change. That's kind of this Canadian rising. That's because you're close to the Great Lakes, Canada is close as well, so it's kind of that Canadian influence there. And then the Western Pennsylvania. So anyone remember what this diphthong is? The AU. This is our ow, like crowd or how. And that's becoming more of a ah, like not. So in the word downtown, rather than the ow in down, it's going to change to the ah. So downtown, okay? A lot different. Okay, next we're going to look at the Mid-Atlantic. These are all going to be part of the Northeastern United States dialects. So with the Mid-Atlantic, we have Maryland, Washington, D.C., Southern New Jersey, and Eastern Pennsylvania. We have the fronting of the oo and the o, as well as an upward movement of back vowels. And we have the R combinations. So we'll have, instead of part, so that R, you're actually going to substitute that, you can see here, with the ah, like caught. So pot, and then for instead of port, so the or, you're actually going to use the sound, or the I'm sorry. You'll use the sound. So instead of port, it's going to be port, okay? In addition, we have the fronting of that ow. And so we're going to front the vowel, for instance, in the word house, that ow. All right. Next, let's talk about New York City. So with the New York City dialect, we have the lack of the post-vocalic R in car, horse, pour. So it becomes less of an R there. It's more ka, ho, po. So we're kind of deleting that. There's less of that R vowel, or the post-vocalic, meaning after a vowel R. So the R after the vowel. There is a distinction between the words Mary, like the name, and then, I don't use this, but Mary, like Merry Christmas, so they use an eh in the Mary. And then also, like I'm going to get married, that's going to use the ah sound. So there is a very clear distinction between those vowels. The tense for the ah, so the ah is becoming more tense. Sorry, I just wanted to see if I was missing anything here. I don't think it's going to let me though. Here we go. Or before. Okay. So with the ah, that's going to become more tense. And in closed syllables like lamb and had, it'll become more tense. However, in open syllables or before the consonant n, you're actually going to have a more lax or relaxed ah sound. In Eastern New England dialect, that's going to be a part of Eastern Connecticut, Rhode Island, Eastern Massachusetts, Southern New Hampshire, and Southern Maine. You'll have the lack of the post-vocalic R, so same as the New York City, and then both the words cloth and lot are going to have that ah, caught, okay? In Western New England, we have the Hudson River Valley, Vermont, Western Massachusetts, and Western Connecticut. And there's smaller differences between the eh and the ah. So eh and ah, there we go, compared to New York. However, it's not as extreme as the Northern City chain shift speakers. Okay, now let's talk about consonants. I'm going to move this over here. Hopefully that doesn't confuse you guys too much. There we go. So with consonants, they're going to be more important for our intelligibility as compared to vowels. There's no single resource on dialectical variation in consonants. However, there are a couple that we've found and that are listed in the book. The first one is going to be the syllable final L. So in Columbus, Ohio, New York, Philadelphia, and rural Wisconsin, they will use the rather than the L. So they'll replace that or substitute it. And one thing I put here is articulation disorder versus dialect. So there are times where with a disorder, we're going to substitute a consonant for a vowel. And that's not going to be correct or something that we want to happen. So the big thing when we're looking at these dialects, and we'll talk about this a little bit further, is making sure to distinguish between, does this person have an articulation disorder, or are these errors more of a dialect, and so they really aren't errors at all. And we'll talk about that in just a couple slides. The other one I want to talk about is the S-word initial clusters. So let's break that down. We have S, word initial, so S at the beginning of words, and then clusters. So clusters mean two consonants next to each other. So we have, for instance, we have the sh sound may be replaced, so the st could be replaced by the sh instead, or the spr, the skr, or the str could be replaced. And this happens a lot in the New Zealand English as well. Okay, next, I'm going to shoot this back up here, sorry guys. I want to talk about African American English. There's lots of different names for this. Probably the one you'll hear most often is African American Vernacular English. AAVE is what it's also known as. And some believe that AAVE is a Creole language. And so what that means is it's a language that's made by having speakers from lots of different languages come in contact with each other, and they have to develop a way to communicate with each other even though they all speak different languages. And so the theory is that when the African slaves were brought to the American colonies, they were from different West African, they all had different West African languages, so they had to develop this Creole language, or this language that speakers from lots of different languages would be able to understand. Okay? And it does have distinctive syntactical, it has very specific morphemes, lexical, and phonological features. Let's talk about some of the characteristics specifically for AAVE. We have metathesis, which is the switching of the order of sounds. So for instance, instead of ask, you might have ax, sorry. So the a, the k, and then this, okay? We have interdental fricative deletion. So we're deleting the interdental fricative. So it would be the absent of the th sound, either voiced or voiceless. So for instance, it's produced as a dentalized T or D. So rather than this, they might say dis. The other might be, instead of using TH, they could use f or v, so the F or the V, like bath instead of bath, or brother or brava instead of brother. Okay. Next we have the post-vocalic R deletion. So post-vocalic means after the vowel, so an R after a vowel, and we're deleting that. So for instance, we also have the word medial R deletion. So instead of Florida, where we have the R in the middle, it would just be flada, flada, okay? We also have the R deletion after the TH. So instead of throw, it would just be tho. So we would delete that R. The other characteristic for AAVE is the L vocalization. So that changes an L to an O or a W. So instead of feel, it might be feo. We might also use the schwa. So feel might be fia. And then we might delete the L altogether. So p instead of pull. Let's continue with some more characteristics here. So we also have cluster differences. There's initial clusters, the sh, the sure, so the SH and the R, and the STR could be reduced just to the S and the R. And the STR, consonant cluster could change to SKR. So instead of street, they could say screet. Okay. We also have some word final clusters. So there's the deletion of the stop and fricative stop clusters. So to give you an example of this, because that's kind of a mouthful, it would be test instead of test. Okay. We also have this big long word. It's monodiphthongization and monodiphthongization. What this is simply using, we're monolizing some of the diphthongs. So we could have fronting of the oo, merging of the I in the before nasals, and then also reducing the I, and so we're taking a diphthong and making it more of a monophthong. And then the last one here is the glide onset differences. So one thing you'll see is, for instance, in U, so the Y, remember, is our J, and then the U is our U, changes to just U. So instead of computer, we would have computer versus computer. So see how that that Y was kind of slipped in there? So they would not have that. Okay, now let's talk about, we talked about this briefly a couple slides ago. I want to touch on it a little bit more. We talked about the dialectical difference versus a speech sound disorder. And sometimes this is hard because a lot of them are really similar, especially when it comes to AAVE. So for instance, if we're talking about similarities between the two, we're going to have production of F and V in words with targets for TH. So TH is being substituted by F and V. That can happen in both dialectical differences or speech sound disorders. We also have the deletion of sounds in consonant clusters. Again, this is going to be a characteristic of both. We have the vocalization of R and L, meaning those sounds get reduced to a vowel. Again, that can be a characteristic of both a speech sound disorder and a dialectical difference. So what do we do? How do we tell the difference between those two? Well, we have to figure out, and we have to remember that it's arising from different origins. So the AAVE child speaker is producing patterns because they have successfully emulated the language around them. Versus a child with a speech sound disorder, that's reflecting a delay or disorder in the learning target language. And then one of the last things I want to talk about, we have a couple more slides left, is the L1 influenced English. So when we're talking about L1, this is language 1, the primary language or the first language. So people who speak English as a second language is what we're talking about here. So the big concept to remember here is that the first language is going to influence the second language. So depending on the similarities of sound structures of English, let me move this so you can see. Doesn't want to move, sorry guys. Okay, there we go. Perfect, sorry about that. Okay, so depending on the similarity of sound structures of English compared to the primary language or the first language, it's also going to depend on the age at which English language was began. So the earlier the better. It'll also depend on the circumstances on which English was learned. So is it more of a formal atmosphere like school? Is it just learning casually? So the amount of influence that the first language has on the second language is dependent on these characteristics. The other thing that's really important to remember, let's talk about like the Spanish language. So in Spanish we have 5 true vowels, okay? However, in English we have those vowels and other vowels and diphthongs. So we have a lot of different vowel options. What's going to happen is someone who's learning English as a second language may use Pete and Pit. They're going to use the same vowel, the E, for both. So those are going to be pronounced Pete and Pit. The E and the I are going to be pronounced the same because they only have the one vowel. They only have this one, this small I, the I. The E. There we go. They don't have this I. So it may take them a while to remember that and to differentiate between Pete and Pit. Okay? The next one, also in the Spanish language, the P, T, and K do not have aspiration, which is different than in English. So again, that's going to show that the Spanish language is going to influence the English learning. So you may have P, T, K without aspiration when they first begin learning English. And then additionally, our vowels A and O, there's going to be there's no diphthong. They're going to be monophthong, true vowels, okay? Again, because there's only those 5 vowels in the Spanish language. Okay, and now I want to talk about the world Englishes. So a majority of the things we've talked about include just the United States, dialectical differences within the U.S. But I do want you to know that English is used outside of the U.S. as primary languages as well. So when you hear them, it's still going to sound different. So people born outside of the United States are going to have a different variety of English compared to our North American dialect. Okay? So for instance, sorry guys, hold on one second. Let me bring myself back. There we go. Okay, sorry about that. We are on the very last slide, so let's go over this really quick. Okay, so with Indian English, we're going to have different patterns of stress compared to the North American dialect. One example I like to give is one of my professors in graduate school was from India, and pretty well easy to understand, but there are always a couple words where the stress that he placed on the word was very different than I would place on the word. And so I remember there was this one word I just couldn't figure out for the longest time what he actually was trying to say. And then finally it came to me and I realized, wow, that really is showing how different the pattern of stress is. So with this word retina, that's how I would say it. So retina, part of your eye, and he kept saying retina. So you could tell how different that is. And without seeing it written, I had no idea what he was talking about. So the Indian English, although it's still English, you're going to have different patterns of stress, and sometimes that can make it difficult to understand. We also have the Mandarin accented English. So there are going to be errors specifically in word final consonants there. And then in the Japanese and Korean English, they have no distinction between R and L. So those are going to be very difficult for them. And you may hear them substitute. So it's not, in those instances, it's not a speech sound disorder. It's a part of their dialect. And that's the big thing I want you all to take away from this, is that the biggest thing we have to do is really learn these dialects so that we're not telling someone they have a speech sound disorder when really it has to do with their dialect. So ASHA, the American Speech and Hearing Association, does state very specifically in their code of conduct that dialects do not mean a speech sound disorder. So just because they have a dialectical difference does not categorize them as having a speech sound disorder. So we need to make sure to be very careful about distinguishing the two. Okay? Now if you have any questions, please post them in Chapter 10 discussion board and I will be happy to answer them. Thank you all very much.